My name is Rachel Stevenson, and I'm the Event and Social Manager here at Identity Automation, and I'll be your moderator today. Today, our presenters are Director of Solutions Engineering, Greg Pearson, and Director of Product, Dave Samia. Today's webinar, the IAM Maturity Model Overview, Understanding the 7 Tenets of Identity and Access Management, is the culmination of last year's 7-part webinar series, which you can find online. So now it's time for the webinar. I'm going to be passing the mic and controls over to Greg for him to give a brief overview of he and Dave's time here at Identity Automation and a further explanation of the full IAM maturity model itself. Take it away, Greg.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome, everyone. My name is Greg Pearson. I'm the Director of Solution Engineering here at Identity Automation. I've been with Identity Automation for 10 years, focusing on identity and access management. Prior to my career here at Identity Automation, I spent a lot of time in technical and leadership roles in various organizations. I'm joined today by David Samia, who's the Director of Product. David, could you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure thing, Greg. So, I've been responsible for the management of software products and portfolios for longer than I care to acknowledge, and everything from ideation to product sunset. And perhaps the single most important aspect of that role, and something that's certainly relevant to today's discussion, is assuring a product's ability to address real-life business challenges, like improving processes, programs, and of course, maturity.
Excellent. Thank you, David. So before we jump into all of the maturity model content, I'd like to spend just a little bit of time setting a contextual foundation around identity management. So first, let's take a look at where IAM sits in terms of the perimeter, the network perimeter, security perimeter. So in the past, we approached cybersecurity using a defense in depth strategy. Basically, we would protect endpoints, we would protect the network perimeter, and secure everything through the use of firewalls, intrusion detection, prevention, and antivirus and malware types of software solutions. So today, though, our network boundary is no longer within just our own walls. As everybody probably is aware, we've moved our perimeter beyond our own boundaries into the cloud. So we have cloud resources, SaaS applications, remote workers, and those that are working from home or remote locations like coffee shops. So one thing has remained though, and that's the identity. So now more than ever, we have to treat identities as a new perimeter and focus even more on securing those identities. So again, looking at what identity management is and setting that foundation, in my past, when I've spoken to a lot of organizations around what they think identity and access management is, typically they're looking at these 3 things: single sign-on, account provisioning, or also known as lifecycle management, or authentication and password management. This perception is very common because it focuses on getting people onboarded or offboarded, gets them into their applications, and keeps them working. All of this is very important, but it's not the whole picture when it comes to identity and access management. So let's take a look at redefining identity and access management. This is important as we go forward with the presentation to talk about the maturity levels. So first, I wanted to kind of set some foundational knowledge here. You may hear either from myself or from Dave, the terms IDM, IAM, or IGA. So when we're talking about that, I kind of want to set the foundation of what those mean: identity management, identity access management, or identity governance and administration. So first, 3 reasons why organizations typically focus on identity management. First, to improve their security posture. Second, to improve overall efficiency in their operations. And third, to improve the overall user experience. So while those things are also important, it's important to focus on diving into what identity management actually is. So 4 areas that here at Identity Automation that we focus on and we believe are critical to any IAM focus or any IAM solution is lifecycle management. And really that just comes down to being a collection of technologies and business processes around the creation, the management, and the removal of identities in the organization. Commonly, this is that perceived IDM. But looking at some of these other areas, such as authentication, that's really a technology or solution that validates a user is who they claim they are. And then you move into things like access management. That's where we control what a given identity has access to and when they are authorized to access that resource. And then last but not least, we focus on governance. These are the processes that enable an organization to define, enforce, review, and audit, including mapping IAM functions to compliance requirements. This also focuses on the audit of access to support reporting needs. We'll drill into much more detail in these areas when we focus on the tenets in the maturity model. So with that foundation, I guess, Dave, can you take us through an even more granular look at what identity and access management is?
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. There's a lot of individual capabilities comprised in those four circles, right? And this is simply a visualization of all of those capabilities and how they interact with each other to provide a comprehensive IAM program. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these things, but just keep in mind, there's a lot going on here that an organization needs to think about. From a preventative perspective, if you look at the left-hand side, these are the capabilities that an organization can put in place to make sure they're governing by policy, right? To effectively assure that users are who they say they are and control what they use and do, all to minimize risk and assure that the right people have the right accesses to the right information at the right time. Now, if we move just a little bit to the right from there, we can leverage analytics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to enable the system to automatically adapt to changes and anomalous behavior in real time. And then, of course, there's the table stakes, right, in the middle, right? Provisioning of accounts and access entitlements with lifecycle automation and access control engines. All of that keeps everything up to date and secure. Now, if you look at the top and over to the right, there's a need to visualize what's occurred and occurring in the organization at any given time, right? Provide a historical journey of what was done by whom, when, and the ability to share all of this identity, access, and governance information with ancillary security systems like SIM tools, Logarithm or Splunk, for example, where it can all be correlated with events that are occurring across the enterprise. Now, I know this looks overwhelming, but no one implements all of these capabilities at once. This is a journey, and most organizations will focus in one, maybe two of these areas at any given time. They'll go as deep as necessary for their needs, and then they'll move on from there, Greg.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate that overview. So with that kind of gets us into, we've got that foundation set now, we can focus on the IAM maturity model. So if you're not aware, previous to this particular webinar, we did a series of webinars covering each of these tenets in deep detail. So all of those recordings are available on our website, as well as a number of blog posts that outline each one of these tenets in that immense amount of detail. So I encourage you to go out and take a look at those if you haven't had the opportunity to attend. So that being said, if we reflect back on the foundation that we set just a moment ago, we'll focus on each of the tenets to define different levels of maturity in each one of these. So as far as this particular slide, one thing I do want to point out, this doesn't indicate the order that these tenets have to be implemented or the approach that you have to take. The order that we're showing here really is looking at the tenets in order from least complex to most complex to implement, although some of these tenets do have some dependencies on other tenets being in place in order to reach certain levels of maturity. So as a quick review, a maturity model is simply a tool that can be used to identify where you are at in terms of functionality and what it takes to get to that next level. Also, just a reminder that not all organizations have to reach the highest level. That's really an organizational decision to determine if you need to reach a certain level of maturity. So with that, Dave, let's take a look at each one of these. If you can start us off by diving into Federation, that would be great.
Sure thing, Greg. So, simply put, for me at least, Federation's a mechanism through which a user can be dynamically authenticated to an application as a result of a previous authentication to another application, right? And so each of these maturity models, they also have a level 0. We're not showing it on the slide, but in this case, if you're not doing any federation, you'd be considered level 0, right? In level 1, though, basic, an organization would have an identity provider, or IDP for short, with one or more applications that are integrated with it using a single sign-on federation method, such as SAML, security assertion markup language. Right? These applications are typically referred to as service providers or relying parties. Now, without federation, each application provides their own user authentication, and each user would authenticate to them with separate user credentials for each. Right? Now, those credentials could be the same, user ID J Smith with password blah, 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 but they are uniquely stored and maintained in each individual application. Now, if any of those applications have service provider capability, Salesforce or ServiceNow, for example, they can form a trust with an IDP and offload user authentication and potentially authorization to that IDP. In this scenario, users wouldn't need unique credentials for those applications, only the credentials to the IDP. And then the IDP would authenticate them to those applications when they logged onto them. It's seamless, frictionless. Now at level 2, integrated, right, this simply puts all of that on steroids and adds additional federation methods such as OAuth, OpenID Connect, or WS Federation into the mix. Right? Because there are different federation methods out there, each time an organization adds support for any one of them, they've enabled their users to single sign-on to a broader range of applications, all with enhanced authentication and authorization capabilities to boot. So level 3, MFA, that increases security a little bit further by implementing multiple types of authentication methods with different types of authentication policies that are very, very granular and adaptive, as well as implementing just-in-time provisioning, which simply stated that's where the IDP sends all of the information necessary to the service provider application during the user's authentication. And we refer to that information as assertions, so that the service provider application can dynamically create the user account if it doesn't already exist. Now, of course, there's a lot more to that, but that's the gist of it. So the ultimate level, level 4, the mesh. Now, this is where an organization has multiple identity providers in the mix, maybe internally, certainly externally as third parties, and managing all of these IDPs and all of the sessions that they're supporting. It can be a rather daunting task, but the wow factor here is the ability for users to access service provider applications without having to have static user accounts. These are virtual user accounts, if you will. So the next steps here, right? Take inventory of all the service providers and IDPs. Also note that if you do go towards meshing, right, that adds a significant amount of risk with the inclusion of all these third-party services. So obviously organizations need to be diligent with their selections here.
Excellent, Dave, thank you. So now we'll move on to multi-factor authentication and what the levels of this particular tenet are. So first of all, authentication really simply is proving who you say you are. So when we think about level 0, again, Dave mentioned that's going to be on each one of these. That's really where we focus on a single factor, like a password. It's something that you know. So when we consider level 0, that's just a one factor, usually a password. As we look at level 1, this is where we introduce at least 2 factors. In this particular level is something that you know and something you have. So if we're thinking about that, it's something you know might be a password or a PIN, and something you have might be a phone, it might be a token, it might be an RFID card or something of that nature. When we get to level 2, and this is where we really start to look at multi-factor for the authentication policy. So we're looking at something you know, something you have, and something you are. So in looking at that, that's something like a password or a PIN, an RFID card or a token, and something like facial recognition or a fingerprint. As we move up into level 3, this is where we start to get adaptive, and we look at risk mitigation and adaptive policies as part of this particular level. Looking at things like contextual factors, the time of the day, the location that they're coming from, trusted devices, Then we're also considering here step-up authentication for high-risk access. And then finally, as we move into level 4, the intelligent level, this is where we introduce artificial intelligence. So here we're looking for patterns. We're watching keystrokes and interaction with keyboards. We're looking at behavior patterns that are defined as normal and comparing that against abnormal activity. So for example, logging in during business hours on a normal routine basis from specific locations, and then something abruptly changes, maybe logging in after hours from a remote location. And then last but not least in this level, this is where we expand the library of authentication methods to accommodate specific scenarios. So based on what your organization has. So as we go through level 1 through level 4, really what we're trying, the goal here is really to move through maturity by building out risk profiles and high risk authentication access needs, and ultimately building in artificial intelligence to respond to authentication requests based on patterns. So with Dave, I'll turn that back over to you for you to talk about single sign-on.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, it's logical next step, right? So the term single sign-on is used a lot, but for me, I like to think about it as the ability for a user to authenticate to one system one time and then access, log into multiple applications without having to re-authenticate, right? And although not shown on the slide, level 0 here means simply your users are logging into each application with credentials that are specific to each and every application. More than likely, though, organizations are at, possibly surpassed level 1, reduced sign-on, which leverages an authoritative password source like Active Directory to ensure that a user's credentials are the same across applications. Now, the user will still need to log in to each application, but they can use the credentials, user ID and password, that they've set in the authoritative source, Active Directory for an example, instead of having unique credentials in each account. Now, I know this isn't really single sign-on, but it does reduce the number of individual user credentials to manage. Now, what we're seeing in the industry, though, we're seeing more and more organizations actually getting up to level 2, which we're referring to as single sign-on, right? And this uses federation, as I described earlier, with federation methods like SAML, OAuth, and OpenID Connect. But this level also includes web single sign-on to applications that don't necessarily support federation, right? And there are other techniques available to dynamically and securely, of course, pass user credentials from an authoritative source to an application during the login process. Now, level 3 extends that capability to non-web applications, typically, Windows client applications, maybe virtual desktops. And then level 4, universal SSO, that takes it even further to non-Windows platforms like Mac and Linux, as well as mobile platforms like iOS and Android. And it also takes the single sign-on setup to a higher level, right? By automating the creation of the single sign-on application definitions, rather than having administrators creating those things by hand. So here, next steps would be, look for technologies that increase usability, right, while decreasing risk, of course, and find a vendor with strong mobile OS options for single sign-on beyond just Windows.
Thanks, Dave. So again, as we move up through our tenets here, we're kind of halfway through the tenets, and we're starting to get into a little bit more complicated areas here. So we'll cover delegated administration next. And when we look at delegated administration, really this is the concept behind delegated administration is giving business users the ability to perform self-service or limited IT functions without the permissions tied to a privileged role. So as we look at this, if we're thinking about level 0 again, that's really no self-service. So there's no self-service password reset, no managing your own profiles. There's no administrative tasks that business users can do. Those all have to go to an IT or a technology group of some sort for being taken care of. So as we look at level 1, this is really our self-service level. So here, this is where users have basic delegation over their own account. This is where they can do limited self-service types of functions. So resetting their own password, maybe retrieving a forgotten username, managing profile attributes, things like maybe a mobile number. They can also, sometimes they have the ability to reset other users' passwords based on some sort of a relationship. So for example, if in the education world, maybe teachers can reset student passwords, or maybe a departmental coordinator can reset only departmental employee passwords. So that's the basic level of self-service. As we move up into level 2, here we're starting to expand capabilities to allow business users to perform lifecycle management of external, or what we call sponsored accounts, and allowing those sponsored accounts to claim their credentials. So this is a great way of not having to introduce another workflow to go through a technology group to get a contractor or a consultant or somebody that's visiting or needs temporary access, but doesn't come through a normal life cycle type of situation into the organization and get them up and working very quickly. And then also within this level, we have the ability to claim accounts, so both for the employees and for those sponsors. And what this, when we refer to claiming accounts, that's basically a person can identify themselves with information only they know, and it can be verified against an IAM system. So it allows them to do things like set their own password and make other selections, such as their MFA method, or potentially answering challenge questions, so that in the future, if they need to do a self-service password reset, they would have those questions already populated with answers. When we move to level 3, this is where we get into more of a distributed model. And this is where end users can help peers based on their relationships. So this allows users to become more of a second level of support next to self-service. So if an individual can't reset their own password, perhaps they can go to their supervisor, and the supervisor has the ability to reset their password so they can be up and running and not have a slowdown in their daily work. And not have to go to technology or IT and put in a ticket to get something reset. Also, this is where we empower business application owners to manage access to the apps they own. So through a set of workflows, they can approve access to a particular application if they're the application owner. This also allows business application owners to manage roles for granting access. So it actually gives them delegated capabilities to manage membership of roles that can be used to apply to the various delegated applications. And then last but not least, this is where we start to introduce fine-grained policies. So we start to look at the very minute details around granting access and determining how we can grant access based on particular attributes or information about an identity. And then finally, as we move to level 4, we become more independent. At this level, this is where governance becomes a part of delegated administration. This is where we allow business application owners to approve initial access and certified continued access to applications. This is also where we can bring things like proxy policies into place, where we can delegate rights to allow peers to approve or certify on behalf of someone in their absence. So as we go through the maturity here in delegated administration, really what we're trying to do is we're trying to remove routine day-to-day administration tasks from IT and put that in the hands of the individuals from a self-service capability, or in business application owners' hands in the case of granting access to their applications they own. And it gives them more control over granting and certifying as well in those applications that they're responsible for. So Dave, we'll move to the next one, which is lifecycle management.
Absolutely. So, Greg, lifecycle management to me, right, this is kind of the heart and soul of everything, right? It's about handling the creation, update, and removal of all of the identities and their roles and their attributes across all of the applications and services that they use. Of course, the goal here is to automate all of that. At level 1, homegrown, what we're looking at are in organizations that, they have scripts, right, that technical folks have written over the years, right, to at least partially automate some of the identity lifecycle management. An example of this would be PowerShell scripts created by an Active Directory team, that take data from an HR system, typically via flat file, and automatically create and if they're savvy enough, possibly update Active Directory. And that's okay, but it's just part of the equation, right? And then, of course, there's other teams that have done similar things with other applications, but of course, they've probably used different methods, and they're all at different levels of completeness. So we step up a little bit to level 2, onboarding. And this is typically the first action to implement in an identity lifecycle program, and often referred to as provisioning. This is about setting up new accesses, and it's typically the starting point because normally it's in response to users requesting access to systems that they currently don't have access to. Right? Level 3 then adds an identity logic engine, right, or really just engine, if you will, that centralizes all of the identity lifecycle management functions, right, managing the entire lifecycle processes, which is made up of numerous events, not just the onboarding aspect of an identity. And then finally, level 4, which is, somewhat of a future concept at this point, right? There are many standards, right, being published today that indicate the industry is headed towards an API-driven direction in order to reduce the complexity of a complete identity lifecycle implementation. Now, API-driven identity lifecycle management really refers to the target or the downstream system pulling the identity information rather than an organization having to design ways to push that data into it. And so next steps here, right, phase out homegrown scripts and really find a vendor that supports identity events like role and attribute changes, right, who also integrates with all of the legacy applications that so many of us still have in our environments today.
Excellent. Thank you, David. So that brings us to access management. So let's take a look at this particular tenet. Just to give a definition again of access management, this is really the concept of ensuring that proper access is granted to valid users and prohibiting access for invalid users through policies. So if we take a look at level 0 here, a lot of times this really comes down to fragmented access to applications or systems. That means that generally that's granted on a manual basis, that somebody goes in and explicitly grants access or explicitly denies access to a particular resource for a particular identity. As we move to level 1 though, this is where we focus on birthright access. So this level here assumes that there's already an engine. Dave just spoke about an engine supporting full lifecycle management across the ecosystem. So when we say full lifecycle, as Dave mentioned, there's much more than just onboarding. It's that onboarding process. It's that change that happens in the middle. So if somebody moves a different role or department or a location, and those things have an impact on access, those things are addressed as well. And then the offboarding piece as well. And then one that a lot of people tend to forget is perhaps there's a rebirth into the organization. Maybe they come back to work for an organization again. So what access do we give them? So in this level, that's where that concept is applied. This also assumes that there's a basic level of governance, which we haven't gotten to yet. Dave's going to talk about that in just a moment. But this assumes there's a basic level of governance in place with an inventory of entitlements defined, which we'll cover next. Then our primary focus here in this level 1 is really a focus on attribute-based access controls and role-based access controls to determine that birthright access. So that's looking at attributes about an identity, what data is available with that identity to make determinations on what access they should get. So are they located at a particular office? Are they do they have a particular job title or job assignment or several job assignments? And then does that make them do they have membership in a particular role, and can we apply that role as part of the access for a particular resource? And then at this level, our exception handling is typically handled manually, so there's not an automated process for that. But as we move into level 2, this is where we start to introduce that automated exception handling. So we're looking at ways to handle things beyond just the birthright and looking at requests. So here we can use things like workflows to make requests for exception handling. It's also here we can associate identities with entitlements. And again, through a workflow process, maybe that has an approval on the back end, as we talked about previously with some of the delegated administration. And then we can also put limits on the duration of that access with capabilities to extend or certify continued access. Then as we move to level 3, which is a little bit more privileged, this is where we move beyond our regular access and we start to focus on privileged access management. So high-risk accounts, high-risk systems and applications, and handling granting access or revoking access from those particular resources as well. So here we see a lot of things like password vaulting, because that's common for having shared passwords to pass to those privileged resources. And then we can also look at dynamically assigning identities to roles, which are in turn associated with entitlements that we can grant access to resources based upon that. And we also here look at having a centralized policy. I know our level 4 is centralized, but we're starting to centralize our policies here, and we're starting to think about using an engine concept here with authorization. Maybe this is where we start to build in a microservice where we can do authorization as a service. And then finally, when we get to level 4, here, our goal is to fully adopt the principle of least privilege everywhere. Every request, every grant, every revoke, and every action is auditable. We start to utilize things like SIM tools to perform correlation and find anomalies and pass those back to the IAM system for action, such as maybe revoking access if we found an anomaly. And then last but not least, this is where we build in artificial intelligence to recognize those patterns and make access management decisions. So as we look through the levels here, really our next steps we're moving from birthright access to mechanisms to support exception access, including privileged access, and integrating SIM and IAM together to make automated access management decisions based on event correlation. And then finally, introducing artificial intelligence to help make some of those decisions as well. So Dave, let's take a look at governance.
Absolutely, Greg. Yeah, this is my favorite area. Governance really improves transparency and, of course, manageability, right, through greater visibility and control all over all of the identities and their accesses. You talked about entitlements a little bit before. So at level 0 here, it's not on the slide, but level 0, that means there's no entitlement repository, right? There's no central certification, and business owners are probably completely out of the loop. They don't have any visibility into or control over who has access to their business applications, right? And so if your organization's at level 0, things are happening through phone calls, emails, at best, they're happening through help desk tickets, but your business owners, they're probably don't have a clue. So in level 1, that's where organizations have started to implement a entitlement repository, right? And that repository has to be capable of presenting a user's accesses throughout the organization. And reporting is key here. It's a key capability in level 1 here, right? I should be able to pull a report from the entitlement repository to see all of the accesses that you, Greg, have throughout all of the systems, right? Including the paper trail that tells me who approved them, what, if any, comments they made, and if you've ever been recertified for them. Now, in advanced level 2, right, we're assuring that what's in the entitlement repository matches what's actually been provisioned by programmatically looking at the accesses defined in the applications themselves. Level 2 is achieved when we're able to reconcile the entitlement repository to the applications. Now, I know that gets a little complicated, but if we use Active Directory as an example, right? If we are able to reconcile an enabled Active Directory user account entitlement, like you were talking about before, Greg, if we're able to reconcile that to an active user account in Active Directory, right, then we've passed. Or maybe there's an enabled Active Directory user account entitlement, or maybe there's not an Active Directory user account entitlement, and there's an user account in Active Directory, but that user account is disabled. So that's still a pass, right? Not in the entitlement repository, but not active in AD, we're still a pass here. On the other hand, if an entitlement is granted and the user doesn't exist or they're inactive, then it's a fail. And if you don't have an entitlement, but there's an active Active Directory account, right? We'd consider that an orphaned AD account, then that's a big fail here. Now, in level 3, we're starting to do this in real time. We're reconciling between the application and the entitlement repository in real time, at least for high-risk resources where we're providing accesses to sensitive information. Now, you don't have to really move away from a full reconciliation. So you might look at Active Directory in real time and reconcile perhaps memberships being changed in the domain administrator group, since that's a high-risk area. And you could also perform a full reconciliation, nightly, weekly, whatever, where we reconcile all of the group information from AD to the entitlement repository. Now, for real-time reconciliation, the IGA system needs to be able to monitor the resources for change as they change, right? Detect those changes, whether it's user created, user changed, added to a group, whatever, right? Then automatically reconcile that change to the entitlement repository. And when drift is detected, automatically take action, right? Even remediate if possible. Now, when we're talking about governance, the primary pain for any organization here is fatigue. Keeping up with all of the requests and all of the certifications, that is really a daunting task. And this is where the IGA system itself can help. In level 4, intelligent, right, we add analytics and artificial intelligence. With good historical data and, of course, proper training, the system can use patterns and trends to determine, right, with an acceptable probability, of course, that an entitlement request or a recertification can be automatically improved, right, and let that happen, while also highlighting those outliers, right, that need additional vetting, right? So we call attention to where attention needs to be. Next steps here, we want to create mappings for our entitlements, right, with an interface that provides real-time query results, and implement a continuous model training to lay the groundwork for artificial intelligence, Greg.
Excellent. Nice overview, David. So let's talk now that we've covered those 7 tenets. Let's start putting some of this together. So if you attended the other webinars, you'll know that I've shown this slide every time, and it's basically an example of what a maturity model scorecard might look like. Now you can use something like a spreadsheet, a simple spreadsheet, to sit down and map out each of these tenets, where you think you are compared with how we've defined each of these levels, to come up with your overall maturity score for identity and access management. What this allows you to do is evaluate those areas you want to focus on, and then come up with a plan to approach each of those areas. So again, as you improve each of these various areas or these various tenets, you're improving your overall maturity index. So again, this is just an example and a reminder, as I said in the beginning, that not every organization has to be at level 4 for every single tenet. It may not make sense for their organization. So that's an organizational decision that you have to make as to the level that you may need to achieve. But at least if you know you need to achieve at least level 3 and you're at level 1, you've got 2 levels to go, and there's a path for getting there. And so let's take a look at how we can actually put this into practice. So as we go through this, I've got a circle here. It says IAM, and that's on purpose because what I want to do is wrap all of this up. I wanted to talk about using all of the insight that we got in the various tenets, evaluate where we are at with each of those and where we need to go. And really it comes down to, how do we do that? Well, the first thing that I want to recommend is every organization needs to treat identity and access management, or identity governance, or whatever term that you use, you need to treat it as a program. It's a never-ending journey. We don't stop. We don't reach a conclusion. We continue to evolve, because as I mentioned at the very beginning, our perimeter has changed over the years. Things will continue to change as technologies emerge, as we transform our digital technology. We have to continue to move that goal line. So we're looking at this as a program, not a project. It's not an IAM project. Now, you'll have projects within your IAM program, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. So let's go through what I think the life cycle of maturing your identity and access management program looks like. So, and this can apply to the overall program, or this can apply to one specific tenant. So I'm going to give you an example of a tenant, but we can think of this in the overall program as well, because as you improve each one of these tenants, you'll improve your overall posture. So step one, determine where you're at now. So if we use an example, we could be currently at level 1 for MFA. So as a reminder, level 1 in MFA is we have at least 2 factors of authentication. So we might be using passwords and we'll say an RFID card. So step 2 then is we need to create a vision and a roadmap. The vision is what you want to accomplish. The roadmap is how you accomplish that vision. So as we think through our example here, our vision might be we want to move to level 3. That is our goal. So level 3 again gets us into a much higher posture where we're using multi-factor authentication. And it also gives us the capability of doing step-up authentication. So to get to level 2, we have to go to level 3. We have to go to level 2 first, and then move into level 3. So our roadmap, the how, is we need to move through level 2 and introduce a third factor. So if we are using passwords and RFID cards, we will probably want to use that third category, which is something we are. So we want to introduce facial recognition or some sort of biometrics, so something that each person is. And then we will also, in order to reach level 3, need to determine which applications we will enforce step-up authentication on. So that's kind of our roadmap. And then as we move to the next step, we got to build a plan. Your IAM, again, should be a journey. You need that plan to get there. So our plan, this is where we start to lay down the tactical steps for introducing that third factor. How are we going to implement facial recognition or fingerprint? Do we have to buy devices? How are we going to enroll people? What are we going to do to put that additional factor in place? And then in addition to that, for us to go to level 3, we know we have to put step-up authentication in front of the applications we identified in step 2. How are we going to do that? What are the steps? How do we roll that out? And as an example, that might be educating our user base on that third factor and educating them on using that application with step-up authentication. So then we move to step 4, which is we execute on our plan. We carry out the steps that we defined. We carry out those tactical plans, and we might be holding webinars for the new factor. We might be issuing job aids. We might be walking people through, by going out and doing visiting the user desks. Maybe we need to provide some sort of incentive for adoption of this. This is where we actually do the execution. This is where you come up with how I'm going to carry this out. And then last but not least, as part of this cycle, we got to measure our success. This is where we determine, did we achieve level 2 of this? Did we roll out a third factor in our MFA plan? Did we move to level 3? Do we have step-up authentication defined for the applications we set out to? Maybe we had trouble with one of those applications and we had to change our plan. We had to change our roadmap a little bit because we had to back off of a particular application. That's okay. We know we can do that. And then we just measure whether or not we actually succeeded. And if we didn't, that's okay, because we can move back into step 1 and go through this all again to do that over. If we have accomplished what we wanted to by moving our MFA, maybe we now approach, can we do something with governance? Can we start down the governance path and do some of the various levels there? Maybe we're at level 1 and we want to go to level 4 and build in some artificial intelligence. Well, we've got a long way to go. We may need to do this. We may need to break each, moving from level 1 to level 2 to level 3 to level 4 of that particular tenant into separate projects and do those in smaller chunks. That's okay. That's why this is a life cycle. So that's application of this particular of the model within practice on that. So with that, that is pretty much the extent of this content. So Rachel, I will turn it back over to you.
So we have a few questions that came in. This first one was asked for Greg. The question is there a logical progression in the maturity model? Basically, where should we start?
That's a great question. So really, when we look at the tenets, there's not a particular order. We define them from federation all the way up to governance. And the reason being because of the complexity of implementing those. It's a little bit easier to implement federation because of there you really, if you have an IDP in place, going out and setting up your service provider, working with your service provider to integrate with your IDP is fairly simple. I won't say it's super simple, but it's much simpler than coming up with a governance program. You know, governance, there's a lot of people involved in the organization at a lot of different levels, and there's a lot of policy defining and things like that, so it becomes very complicated. If I had to pick one area to start, though, I think Dave actually alluded to this a little bit earlier, is I would start with lifecycle management. The reason being is lifecycle management sort of is the centralized piece of getting those identities into everything you need before you start doing other things. So in other words, you know, as I mentioned in access management, you have to have a fully functioning engine to take care of the life cycle of your identities before you can start automating the access and granting that access or revoking that access. Same with the governance. I mean, knowing what entitlements go to who, you probably should have some identities in place to apply those to, and et cetera. We could go through each one. So lifecycle really is that place to start. And it's one of the bigger challenges. And that's why it's down the path, because there's a lot of moving parts to it, but it makes the most logical sense to start there. So that's a great question.
Great. And now this one was asked for Dave. It says, you mentioned several federation methods. Which ones should we use?
Great question as well. So we say if you want to get to level 1, you should probably start with SAML, right? The security assertion markup language. We say that because that's the predominant federation method that's in the marketplace. There's a lot of applications that have adopted that, right? But it's about haves and needs, right? What do you have in your organization, and what do you need to accomplish with federation? All right, so you can kind of set a goal. If you corral all of the applications that you want to be able to single sign on through federation with, see what they support, because not all applications support all methods, right? But then you also have to look what your needs are. What are you trying to achieve, right? Because some of the more advanced methods might support those goals. So I'd say SAML is the easy one. It's predominant in the marketplace, but you should really look at what all your applications have, find the common thread that runs between them, and of course, understand what it is you're trying to achieve, and will SAML meet those needs, or do you need a different method for that?
Okay, so this last question is also for Dave, and it asks, with regards to certifications, who should be doing that?
Oh, that's another great question. So, you know, I have access, right, as an employee of IA, I have accesses to applications, and, you know, the person that really shouldn't be approving those is my manager. My manager doesn't necessarily know, you know, what the business goals for that application, what the security risks of that application. We believe, right, the best practice would be application owners. Right, and that kind of goes with what does Gartner refer to it as, the entitlement owner, and they have a model for this as well, but it puts control in the hands of the individual or organization that's responsible for the security of that application, you know, as opposed to just having somebody's manager approve those accesses. You know, if I have access to Salesforce, the business owner responsible for Salesforce should be saying Samia should have access to that application or not, because at the end of the day, they're the ones responsible for the security of that application. So great question. We believe entitlement owners, as Greg just said, application owners should be responsible for doing that.
Perfect. So thanks again, everyone, and we hope everyone has a great day.